So now we're going to talk about the way science works. A little bit more detail. We're going to kick into the scientific method. We're going to go over measurements a little bit, okay? So here are our objectives here today. We've got to describe the steps of the scientific method. We've got to identify the prefixes and perform metric conversions. We'll do a couple of those practice, but we'll practice those in class as well. We'll define the common measurements of volume, mass, weight, and temperature. And we're going to name and use SI units for common measurements. Okay. So, first thing we want to talk about is the scientific method. And if you'll notice, we've got some steps here, and then we have this little cycling type of thing that's happening, right? Where things are jumping from one place to the next. Now, it's really important for you guys to understand that the scientific method is not really a series of steps. So a lot of times we talk about scientific method being a series of steps, but it's not really a series of steps. It has steps in it, but because we can kind of jump and go back and go forward, then we don't really want to call it a series of steps. But there are steps in the scientific method that we kind of want to follow through. Okay, so first thing we do is we start with an observation, right? And this could be an observation you make while you're eating, pizza at your house. I mean, any sort of observation that you have. Then you're going to ask a question. Why is this cheese so stringy? And then you're going to start doing some research. Okay, research, collect data. You might want to see if other people have done research on the stringiness of cheese, or maybe they have, and so you're fine. If not, maybe you want to collect some data on yourself. What do you already know about the question? What can you actually figure out from what you can observe? All right, so then we are going to form a hypothesis, and this is basically your guess. I think that cheese is stringy because, and then you can talk about, whatever you might have discovered based upon your research. And then you're going to have an experiment that you come up with. So you're going to test that hypothesis with your experiment. And then you're going to potentially find out, okay, with your observation, that your hypothesis is correct, or maybe it's not correct. And so you're going to conclude something. You'll draw those conclusions, which might bring you right back to the starting point. And you might have to start all over again, and you might be forming a different hypothesis. And then you're going to test that new hypothesis. So this can happen over and over and over and over again. And it might take a long time. When I was in college, I spent all 5 years of my college plan doing experimentation. And I would try something, it wouldn't work, I had to go try something else. And it's just one of those things. My senior project that I had in college, I didn't ever find out the answer to the question that I was asking because I just kept doing that loop. But that's okay. That's all part of science. And one of the things you have to understand about science is that that process of discovery, every time you discover something that doesn't work, you've discovered something, right? Think about Edison with the light bulb. How many times did he find out what did not work? He eventually found out something that did, but he had to find out a whole bunch of things that didn't work, and that was important information. So in science, don't be upset if you get some information that doesn't work, because it's still working. All right, so we want to talk about the scientific method, and we want to talk about what an experimental variable is and what a control is, okay, and what kind of control groups we might have or control parts we might have. So, scientific method. Now, again, you'll notice here, right after I told you it's not a series of steps, we have this as a definition that we have in our book, right? It actually talks about it being a series of steps, even though it's not really a series of steps. Exactly. And so we are, though, trying to solve a problem. And so I like to actually think, instead of a series of steps, I like to think of a way of thinking. Okay, so you should know a series of steps. That's kind of a classical approach to it. But if we think about the scientific method as being a way of approaching a problem, okay, how we think as we approach a problem that we're trying to solve. The idea behind the scientific method is we're trying to solve a problem. And so it's your approach to that problem. How it is that you're going to break things down, test and retest, do more research, that kind of thing. That's what the scientific method is all about, okay? It's this process of thinking, of tackling that problem. Now, in an experiment, okay, you are going to have something called an experimental variable. And that experimental variable is going to be something that you're going to change to see if your hypothesis is correct. Is there a change? Okay, so when you introduce an experimental variable, you're trying to find out, is there a change in your data once you've actually done your experiment? Okay, that's the experimental variable. Now, there's a lot of variables in an experiment, and most of those variables we're trying to control. Okay, but there's one variable that we are purposefully changing so that we can see if there's an effect from it. And that experimental variable, a lot of times we're going to also refer to as an independent variable, because it's the thing that we can control how it's changed. And so a control group, okay, is something where that group, unlike the experimental group, that group has not had anything changed to it. All the factors, all the environments are exactly the same between the control group and the experimental group, except for that one experimental variable. Okay, now there's other terms that we sometimes use. We'll use the term control to talk about the things that we control, like, oh, I want to make sure the temperature is the same, and I want to make sure the amount of water I give the plants is the same, that kind of thing. But the control group is an experiment which you're not changing or modifying anything. Everything's going to be the same between control group and experimental group, except for that experimental variable. Okay? So we test a single variable at a time so that we can see if there's a change, right? We want to know, is there a change in that thing that we're testing, okay? So we have to identify the variable that's causing a change. And so we have the control group to eliminate the other variables. We got to figure out, oh, it's not the temperature, it's not the amount of water, it's the blah, 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 right? And then why do we do mini trials? We want to make sure we confirm the results. In science, when you do statistical analysis, you might think, oh, 5 tests is enough. And, you know, in some statistical tests, it might be the bare minimum. But really, in scientific testing, we want to do trials at least 30 times. We want to have at least 30 trials before we start saying anything statistically is valid in an experimental test. And so, you know, you might watch Mythbusters. I love Mythbusters. One thing that drives me crazy is that they'll make conclusions based upon 1 or 2 tests. And really, great science, and they're doing good science, but they're not doing great science, although they're doing great things for science. You would want to have 30 trials. And, you know, and if you've ever watched them, they actually talk about the fact that they don't do enough trials. And they understand that they're not doing great science. They're just getting us excited and interested in it, which I love. All right, so now let's go ahead and jump into measurements, okay? So that's the scientific method. Again, scientific method, huge benefit to mankind. One of the things that's important to kind of realize is that a lot of times when we think about the ancient history, right, we think about ancient Greek philosophers. Now, there were some scientists back then, right? We think about things like people like Archimedes and things like that. But a lot of people did not really do a lot of tests, right? Most people did not do tests to try to figure out what the truth was. They just kind of came up with these thought experiments. And so, you know, as we started hitting into the Renaissance time, we were starting to understand things a little bit better in terms of how to apply scientific thinking. Francis Bacon was one of those. Roger Bacon, I forget. Roger Bacon, I think. Anyway, a lot of those guys were really trying to help us understand how to then take down the notes of the experiments that we did, and then we can pass that stuff on to somebody else. And so one scientist can learn from another scientist, and then we can all keep growing. Because if we all had to start and, you know, learn everything from the very beginning, then we wouldn't get very far in science. So that's why we write things down in science, and why we, you know, do things like practice taking notes and all sorts of stuff with our lab reports, recording everything, because we want one scientist to be able to build on another scientist's ideas. Anyway, okay, so measurements. Scientists have got to be measuring things, right? Now, in the scientific field, we use the International System of Units, or Système International des Unités, as if I could speak French, right? So this is the International System of Units that we use across the world. Now, here in America, we don't typically use this in our everyday talk, right? But in a science laboratory, we do use this. And the rest of the world, except for like 3 nations, I think it's the United States and 2 other really small nations, I can't remember what they are right now, everybody uses the metric system except for those 3 little countries. And so we want to make sure that we're using the metric system. The metric system is a little bit different than the SI system, okay? So understand that the metric system is kind of a broader category, and SI uses the metric system to give us a bunch of different measurements. But SI is a little bit more specific than metric, okay? So these are the units that we use as scientists, and the reason we use them for a couple different reasons. One of them is because it's very consistent and very easy to calculate, okay? So easy to calculate, and it is consistent. And you know, one of the things with the system that we have used in America for so long, in the United States of America, I should say, is we have these crazy different conversions, right? 12 inches in a foot, 5,280 feet in a mile. Well, in the SI system and in the metric system, things are much, much easier to calculate between, because we have always got factors of 10 that relate everything. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go here. So these are some base units. Now, when we talk about base units, we're talking about measurements that are used for various different types of concepts. So we have things like length, mass, time, temperature, electric current, amount of a substance, and luminous intensity. These are all real basic concepts that we use in science every day, right? And so we have units to describe the quantity. Now, remember in science that we always want to have units expressed with any number that we have, okay? And so if I want to, give you a value, I can't just say 15. I want to say 15 meters. And these are the abbreviations for these things. Having a unit on something actually makes it a quantity, okay? So if all you have is a number, that's what we call it, a number. If you add a unit to the number, you now have a quantity. And that quantity is something that describes various different main components of our life in the scientific system. A couple things you might want to notice. We have K here, means is for Kelvin. That's a capital K. And notice that there's no degree sign on that. Celsius has a degree sign. We use Celsius a lot, but in the scientific laboratory, we would actually want to use K a lot of times, especially when we're dealing with gases. Okay, so those are some of our base units. Now we can derive other units from those base units, and there are so many units, and we'll talk this year about how we derive one unit from another. It's a lot of fun with regard to the math of the whole thing. Now, if we are trying to list these guys from large to small, hit pause on your video right now. Go ahead and try to figure it out yourself. I'll go ahead and start writing them in, and now you'll unpause. Once you get it done, you can check it out, right? So the largest has got to be over here. So the largest one is a kilometer. And they all have ones on them, so we don't have to worry about the number there. These are all quantities. So 1 kilometer is going to be larger than 1 meter. That's the next biggest one, which is then larger than 1 centimeter. And that's the smallest one, larger than 1 millimeter. Okay? So those are the units. Make sure that you know the units. You're going to be using these day in and day out in science for the rest of your scientific career, whether that's just in high school or it goes beyond. Okay, so make sure you know the units and how big each of these are. Basically, if we look at the next slide, we can see that we have various prefixes that describe the different numbers that we have. And this is easy if you just start remembering what these different little symbols mean. K means 1,000. It's a kilo, right? And so, you might have heard somebody talking about money. They're like, yeah, it's 5K, right? 5 grand. You might know 5 grand, that's 1,000. Well, 5K is the same thing, right? So think about K. It's a kilo, and it means 1,000. So if I were to tell you you're running a 5K marathon, not exactly a marathon, is it? That's not a marathon. If you were running a marathon, then I might tell you something in kilometers, or if I just say you were running a 5K run, you would say, oh, that's 5,000 of what? Well, 5K, km, kilometers, right? So the km is kilometers. So you're running 5,000. It's 5 kilometers, 5,000 meters. Okay, so each of these means something now. You have the amount you're running, 5, amount of what? Kilometers, right? 1,000 meters, 5,000 meters. This is kind of like the number, and this is the unit that you're talking about. Okay, so if I were to say I'm running 5 decimeters, then that little part right there is basically my number. it's instead of 5,000, 5 times 1,000, it's 5 times 10, which is 50. So I'd be running 50 meters, okay? Sorry, that's a decameter. I said decimeters. Decimeters is even smaller, right? So a decimeter is 1/10 of a meter. So in this case, I'd just be running 5/10 of a meter. So ready, here's my run. Whoop, done, right? So it's a really quick one. So then you've got some other units, things that you don't necessarily have to memorize, but it's kind of fun to memorize. Mega, giga. Now you've probably heard of gigabytes, right? And megabytes in your computers. Mega means 1,000,000, giga means 1,000,000,000. You can go down the other side. You can go to really small things like a nano, which is 1,000,000,000th. Okay. You can go even higher. You can go to things like exo and tera, and exabytes, terabytes are still things that we use in computers as well. So kind of fun stuff. And again, there's a lot more. The ones that you should probably really know are going to be these here, right? So you should probably know milli means 1,000th, okay, 0.001. Centi is 100th. So you could say, hey, there's 100 centimeters it's equals to 1 meter, okay? So 100th means that I've broken a meter down into 100 little pieces, and that's 0.01. Decimeter is 1/10 of a meter, okay? So that's basically another way to write it is your fraction. Oh, that's 1/10 of a meter, okay? We could write this one as 1/100th of a meter. Okay, so milli is 1,000th, micro is got this really interesting U shape. It's kind of like a U with a little tail in front of it, and that's 1,000,000th. Okay, so a micrometer is 1,000,000th of a meter, and then of course I told you that the nanometer was 1,000,000,000th of a meter. Okay, so those are some common units that we would use. You can also go on the other side of that and go to the bigger ones, right? So pause real quick. See if you can figure these out. I'm going to put them answers on, and then make sure you memorize these. These are common ones, so you should know that for every 1 kilometer, we have 1,000 meters. For every 1 meter, we have 100 centimeters. Now, I want you to notice something here, because it's important that you always put the bigger number with the smaller unit. Notice how my numbers and my units are changing here. That if I have a smaller unit, I know a kilo is bigger than a meter, right? If I have a kilometer is bigger than a meter, then my bigger number goes with my smaller unit, and my smaller number, 1 in this case, goes with my bigger unit, okay? So the smaller number always goes with the bigger unit, the bigger number goes with the smaller unit. So then we go to millimeters and meters, and in 1 meter, I have 1,000 millimeters, okay? So that's how that works. Hopefully you hit pause and you were able to figure that out. If not, now you know what to memorize, okay?